Chapter 18. The boy was dead, but the girl wasn't. And now the young man was trying to destroy Alexia's home, and it wasn't a game or an experiment or something to observe. He had to die, in pain and misery. How had he dared to consider such a thing? He should be on his knees in front of her, a worthless supplicant for her to do with as she wished. How dare he? Alexia saw the siblings walking away from their treacherous deed, felt them wishing to leave as the automated sequence began, lights and sounds flashing, systems shutting down throughout the terminal. Their perfidy was useless, of course. She would be able to stop the destruct sequence with a minimum of effort, using her control over the organic to sever every connection in the facility. But it was the thought behind the act that so infuriated her. He had witnessed the glory of her capabilities. He had seen it and fled in terror. And yet he could fancy himself worthy to take a life such as hers? Alexia gathered herself, drawing all of her power in, becoming complete. She knew that the young man had picked up a weapon that had been sitting next to the keyboard, a revolver that someone had left behind. She didn't object, knowing that the firearm would give him hope, and that for a victory to be complete, the victor had to take everything. She would take his hope, she would take his sister's life, and then she would take his. When she was whole, she imagined herself becoming liquid, traveling through the structure of her surroundings as easily as the organic extensions she controlled. And then she was doing so, moving to confront the interlopers. They were startled, as if they'd expected to succeed. She slid out from inside her organic carrier, unfolding herself, turning to look into their dull eyes, their wincing sheep's faces. She watched them watch her, curious in spite of her anger. They argued in front of her, he insisting that he would handle things, that the girl should flee. The girl accepted, but reluctantly, insisting in turn that he should survive. Following that ludicrous statement, the girl turned and ran for the elevator. Alexia moved to intercept, raising her hand to smite the girl, and a perforation opened in her flesh, distracting her. A bullet had entered her body. She turned and smiled at him, at the gun in his hand, and she reached into herself, pulling the bullet out and tossing it toward him. As gratifying as his expression was, the girl was gone by the time she turned back. It was time to expand her boundaries, Alexia decided, to show him what she was, what she could do, and to put the fear of God into him. Because as she closed her eyes, imagining, wishing, she stopped being Alexia Ashford and became Wrath, divine and merciless. Chapter 19. The self-destruct sequence has been activated, the recording intoned, reverberating through the room, crowding out the rest of its message. You have 4 minutes 30 seconds to reach minimum safe distance. Combined with the sirens and flashing emergency lights, Chris was on sensory overload before the fight even began. Alexia raised her hand to hit Claire, and Chris fired, the 357 bucking in his hand, the shot blasting over the self-destruct alarms, deafeningly explosive. Yes, a clean hit, right through the gut, and Claire was already at the elevator, pushing the button and stepping inside. But instead of bleeding, instead of faltering even a step, Alexia smiled at him. She lifted one of her slender gray hands and pushed it into her body, the flesh molding seamlessly, flowing like water. A second later, she held up the round he'd nailed her with and gently tossed it in his direction. Bad. This is very, very bad, Chris thought numbly, and then she started to change. The lithe, gray female crouched on the metal grid, and her liquid flesh started to tremble, to form tiny peaks and dips all across her body, the tissue bubbling, expanding. The peaks became mountains, the dips, valleys, all of it gray and swelling as her limbs started to fold in on themselves. Her arms curved over and joined the growing mass, the legs disappearing into it, the texture turning rough and striated, veins like cables rising, and she kept swelling. Her head rolled down and became part of the giant, rounded body of her, gray becoming muscle tissue red, the purple and blue of blood vessels networking across like a tide. "You have 4 minutes to reach minimum safe distance," someone said, but Chris barely heard her. He was backing away, becoming more and more convinced that this was not going to end well. The elevator was blocked, and she just kept getting bigger. Thick tentacles pushed out from beneath the elephantine mass, undulating like waves, spreading out across the platform. Chris's back hit a wall, stopping him, and the massive tumorous thing, suddenly rose up as if unbending from some non-existent waste, spreading giant wings, a dragonfly's wings, raising a contorted and deformed half-human face. The face opened its mouth and a gigantic roaring shriek spilled out, the wings trembling from the raw power of the sound. And then it spit at him, a thin stream of yellow-green bile that splashed on the platform at its feet and began to eat through the metal. "Shit!" Chris shouted, and barely jumped out of the way as one of the tentacles slashed forward. He had to watch the mouth and the tentacles at the same time, and from rounded, quivering pink spears that had grown up around the base of the giant body, moving things began to crawl out. Chris ran to the farthest corner from the Alexia thing and raised a .357, not sure where to shoot. The small sub-creatures were landing on the platform, like some flat, rounded rocks with tentacles, some like beetles, some like nothing he'd ever seen before, and they were all coming toward him, moving fast. The eyes. If you can't kill it, maybe you can blind it. But the eyes were already blind, round gray holes with darkness underneath, and he'd already seen how effective bullets were against her flesh. That decided it for him. Chris took aim and fired, and the pulsating, bloated creature was screaming again, this time in pain, one of her wings fluttering down to the platform. A few of the small organisms had reached him, one of the beetle creatures leaping onto his leg, trying to climb up. Disgusted, he brushed it off, but there was another to take its place, and a third. A tentacle flew at his face, shot from one of the rounded stone shapes. Chris blocked it, but barely. "Move!" "You have 3 minutes, 30 seconds to reach minimum safe distance." Chris ran along the back wall, reached the other corner in front of the creature, and targeted again, trying for another wing. The shot went high, but the next one hit. It howled, the broken wing hanging from shredded connecting tissue, and then spit again, the stream of bile missing his face by inches. The thing now had only its 2 uppermost wings, and though he knew he'd hurt it, it didn't seem to have suffered anything close to serious injury. And I have only 2 rounds left. There had to be something he could do, some way to stop it. The self-destruct was going to blow all of them to hell, and it would be his fault. He leaped away as another tentacle whipped out from the creature's base, trying to think. This was a goddamn emergency, and he had to think. Emergency release only. The bloated monster shrieked. More of the beetles were jumping at him, but he ignored them, having only to turn his head to see the inset weapon next to the door, the one with the lockdown bar. A grenade or rocket launcher, whatever it was. It was beautiful, but the bar was still down. It hadn't released. "You have 2 minutes to reach minimum safe distance." Shik. The bar flipped up. Chris snatched it out, lifting and aiming it at the creature's swollen guts. He didn't know what it would do, but he hoped it was good. He hoped it would shut that bitch down. There was no safety, nothing to chamber. Chris pulled the trigger, and a fury of white light and heat leaped from the barrel, blowing into the fat belly like an arrow into a balloon. The effect was huge, the explosion monstrous. A fountain of blood and gray jelly splattered out from the gaping, ragged hole, backsplattering onto his face. But he only had eyes for the screaming Alexia beast as its flesh and bone form gave out, deflating. The upper body of the creature was trying to pull free from the dying mass, the two wings flailing frantically at the air. But with only two, it couldn't free itself. And so it was dying. He knew because he could see its blood draining away, because the color of its horrid flesh was changing, turning ashy, the sub-creature shriveling because of the absolute, complete hatred on its face, and the absolute surprise. As the Alexia monster fell silent and began to sag, her features dripping, Chris heard that he had 1 minute left. Claire. He dropped the incendiary launcher and ran. Chapter 20. Claire felt like shit, and there was nothing she could do about it. Steve was dead, and Chris would either come or he wouldn't. And whatever happened, everything was going to blow up pretty soon, and she had no say in any of it. You have 2 minutes to reach minimum safe distance, the computer politely informed her, and Claire extended her middle finger toward the closest speaker. If there was a hell, she knew what they played in the elevators instead of music. There was only one jet where the elevator had let her out, and Claire sat on the railing in front of it, her arms tightly crossed, her stare fixed on the elevator doors. She watched and waited, her anxiety building, a part of her believing completely that he wasn't coming as the alarms blared through a mostly empty hangar, echoing back at her. Don't leave me, Chris, she thought, clutching herself tighter. She thought of Steve, remembering the laugh attack he'd inspired back on the island. How he'd looked at her like she was crazy. Come now, Chris, she thought, closing her eyes and wishing it as hard as she could. She couldn't lose him too, her heart wouldn't be able to stand it. There was 1 minute to reach minimum safe distance. When the building started to rumble beneath her feet, she thought she might cry, but there were no tears. She went back to watching the elevator door instead, certain now that he was gone, so sure that when the door opened and he stepped out, she thought she might be hallucinating. Chris? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, and he was running toward her, splashes of blood and something else smeared across his face and arms. And that was when she understood that he was real. She wouldn't have hallucinated him with goop on his face. Chris! Get in, he commanded, and Claire jumped into the second seat, happy and scared and anxious, lonely and relieved, wishing that Steve was with them and sad that he wasn't. There were more feelings, seeming dozens, but at the moment, she couldn't handle any of them. She pushed them aside and didn't think at all, didn't feel anything but hope. Chris tucked them in tight and started pushing buttons, the small jet roaring to life. Above them, the ceiling slid apart, the storm clouds breaking up overhead as he lifted them out of the hangar, smooth and easy. A few seconds later, they were blasting away, leaving the dying facility behind. Chris's shoulders relaxed, and he wiped his hand across his forehead, trying to rub off the sour-smelling gunk. I could use a shower, he said lightly, and the tears finally welled up, spilling over her lower lashes. Chris, I thought I'd lost you too. Don't leave me alone again, okay? She asked, doing what she could to keep the tears out of her voice. Chris hesitated, and she instantly knew why. Knew that it wasn't over for either of them. That was too much to ask. Umbrella, she said, and Chris was nodding. We have to settle this, once and for all, he said tightly. We have to, Claire. Claire didn't know what to say, finally opted not to say anything. When the explosion came a moment later, she didn't look. She closed her eyes instead, leaning back into her seat, and hoped that when she finally slept, she would dream. Epilogue. Miles away, Wesker heard the explosion and could see the smoke rising shortly after, thick black plumes of it. He thought about circling the jet back, but decided against it. There was no point. If Alexia wasn't dead, his people would find out soon enough. Hell, the world would find out soon enough. "I hope you were in there, Redfield," he said softly, smiling a little. Of course he was. Chris wasn't bright enough or fast enough to have gotten out in time. Although he might be lucky enough. Wesker had to concede that much. Redfield had the luck of the devil. It was a shame about Alexia turning him down. She'd been something, terrifying and evil, but definitely something. His employers weren't going to be happy when he came back without her, and he couldn't blame them. They'd shelled out plenty for the Rockford attack, and he'd practically promised them results. They'll live. If they don't like it, they can find themselves a new boy. Trent, on the other hand. Wesker grimaced, not looking forward to their next meeting. He owed the man. After the Spencer fiasco, Trent had, quite literally, pulled his ass out of the fire and arranged for him to be fixed up, better than new. And he'd been responsible for Wesker's introduction to his current employers, men with real aspirations for power and the means to obtain it. And he'd never admit it out loud, but Trent scared him. He was so smooth, well-mannered, and soft-spoken, but with a glitter in his eyes that made him always seem to be laughing, like everything was a joke and he was the only one who got it. In Wesker's experience, the ones who laughed were the most dangerous. They didn't feel like they had anything to prove and were usually at least slightly insane. "I'm just glad we're on the same side," Wesker assured himself, believing it because he wanted to. Because going up against someone like Trent was a bad plan. Well, he could worry about Trent later, after he'd made the proper apologies to the proper agents. At least Boy Scout Redfield was dead, and he was still alive and kicking, working for the side that was going to win when all was said and done. Wesker smiled, looking forward to the end. It was going to be spectacular. The sun had come out and was reflecting against the snow, creating a brilliant radiance, blinding in its perfection. The small plane shot away, its shadow chasing it across the sparkling plains. The end. You have been listening to the novelization of Resident Evil Code Veronica by S.D. Perry. I would like to thank each and every one of my subscribers for your support throughout the reading of this book. If you would like to continue to support my work, please consider becoming a patron on my Patreon page. I would greatly appreciate it. Until next time, guys, this is Kooky217 signing out. Take care, and God bless.